It was an ordinary morning when Amara Johnson stepped out of her apartment in downtown Atlanta, dressed in her sharpest business attire, a tailored blazer, a knee-length skirt, and her ever-so-reliable heels that had carried her through countless meetings and flights. The sun, casting its early morning rays through the tall glass buildings that surrounded her, was just starting to break through the cloud cover. Amara had always loved the mornings, a time when the city felt like it was still waking up, full of possibility and promise. Today was supposed to be another routine day. She was about to board a flight to New York for an important business meeting with potential clients. She'd been working hard for this moment, putting in countless hours over the past few months to prepare. This was her big chance to finally prove herself. If everything went well, it could lead to a significant promotion, a boost in her career that she'd worked tirelessly for. As she entered the building and greeted her doorman, she gave him a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Green," she said, her voice light with the confidence that came from years of pushing past obstacles. It was a feeling she was familiar with, the constant pressure of being not just good enough but excellent, always. She was used to being one of the few black women in corporate spaces, but that had never stopped her from climbing the ranks. She could hear her phone buzz in her bag, a soft reminder that she had a busy day ahead. Checking it quickly, she saw a text from her assistant, "Amara, I confirmed your seat in first class for the flight. All set for 1 p.m. departure on time." She smiled to herself. It had taken years of perseverance, but now she could comfortably enjoy the perks of success. Flying first class was a small luxury she had earned. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about having worked hard enough to deserve it. As she made her way to the airport, the usual hustle and bustle of the city filled her senses. People walking briskly down the sidewalk, taxis honking for attention, and the distant hum of the freeway signaled that life was moving as usual. Inside her cab, she adjusted the strap of her leather bag and let out a quiet sigh of relief. A little time away from the office would be a breath of fresh air, even if it was just for a day. The airport was a familiar sight. The giant glass walls of the terminal allowed the sun to pour in, casting a golden glow over the rows of waiting passengers. The air smelled of coffee and fast food, mingling with the faint but distinct scent of jet fuel. Amara moved through the terminal with ease, her experience as a frequent flyer showing in the way she effortlessly navigated the crowds. She was a regular in the airport, not just as a traveler, but as a businesswoman who understood the rhythm of flights, delays, and tight schedules. She approached the check-in counter and greeted the attendant with a smile. "Good afternoon," she said politely, handing over her boarding pass. The attendant looked up from the screen, nodded, and then typed in Amara's details. "First class today, huh?" the attendant remarked with a smile. "Nice. Let me double-check everything for you." She clicked a few more buttons, her fingers tapping rapidly on the keyboard. Amara gave her a small nod, trying to keep the butterflies of anticipation at bay. She had a feeling that this trip would go smoothly. But the moment the attendant looked up again, her expression shifted. There was something in her eyes, a slight hesitation, that Amara couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it seems there's been an issue with your seat," the attendant said, her voice stiffening. "Your first-class seat is no longer available." Amara blinked, thinking she hadn't heard her right. "Excuse me?" she asked, her calm demeanor slowly giving way to confusion. "I purchased that seat months ago. There must be a mistake." "I'm afraid not," the attendant replied, now fidgeting nervously. "There's been some sort of system error, and your seat has been reassigned." Amara's heart sank. She could feel a wave of frustration rising in her chest. She had always prided herself on remaining composed in stressful situations, but this was different. This wasn't just an inconvenience, this was a mistake that shouldn't have happened, especially when she had gone through the proper channels to confirm everything. "Are you telling me that I paid for a first-class ticket, and now you're telling me it's not available?" Amara asked, her voice steady but firm. She had a way of speaking that made people listen. It wasn't just about the words she said, but the confidence with which she said them. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." "I really am," the attendant replied, offering an apologetic smile. "But we have no more first-class seats available. We can offer you a seat in economy, though. I can get you rebooked immediately." Amara stood still for a moment, trying to absorb what had just happened. She'd been working hard, striving for a level of success that would allow her to enjoy these perks. She'd earned this first-class seat, and now she was being told it meant nothing. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. "No," she said after a long pause. "I don't want a seat in economy. I paid for first class, and I expect to sit in first class." The attendant hesitated for a moment, and Amara could see her growing uncomfortable. "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do," she said, her tone now tinged with frustration. "You can take a seat in economy, or we can issue a refund." A mixture of disbelief and anger bubbled up inside Amara. She had no intention of accepting a refund. She wasn't about to let this go without a fight. But more than that, a thought started to form in her mind: why was this happening? Why was she, of all people, being treated like this? "Is there a manager I can speak to?" Amara asked, her voice cool but tinged with determination. The attendant nodded quickly. "I'll get a supervisor for you." Within minutes, a man approached the counter. He was tall, middle-aged, wearing a crisp uniform that signified his managerial status. Amara could see that he was already annoyed, as though he had been called in to deal with yet another difficult customer. "Ma'am, I understand there's a problem," he said, his voice professional but dismissive. "I'm Jason Hart, the supervisor. What seems to be the issue?" Amara explained the situation calmly, outlining how she had purchased her first-class ticket months ago and had received confirmation. The supervisor nodded, but his eyes never met hers, and his body language suggested he wasn't truly listening. "Well, ma'am," he began in a bored tone, "these things happen sometimes. The system glitches, and we end up with overbooked flights. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do right now. We can offer you a seat in economy or refund your ticket." The more Jason spoke, the more Amara felt a growing sense of injustice. There was something dismissive in his words, something that made her feel like she wasn't being taken seriously. She could feel the heat of frustration rising in her chest again, but she held it back, focusing instead on the principle of the matter. She wasn't just any traveler. She was a professional. She deserved to be treated with respect. "I'm not asking for a refund," Amara said, her voice sharp now. "I'm asking for what I paid for. A first-class seat." Jason Hart sighed. "Ma'am, I've explained the situation. We don't have any other options." For a moment, Amara considered her options. She could take the refund and let it go, but that felt like defeat. She could let it slide and accept the economy seat, but she wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. "No," Amara repeated. "I won't settle for less. I will not accept anything less than the seat I purchased." Jason's face hardened slightly, and he turned to speak to a colleague behind him. They whispered for a moment before turning back to Amara. "Ma'am, we'll have to ask you to leave the gate area if you refuse to board the economy flight. We need to clear this situation up." Amara's heart raced. She was being asked to leave. The anxiety that had been building up inside her suddenly gave way to something else: anger, pride, and defiance. She had no intention of letting this go quietly. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "I've been patient, but this is not acceptable." And at that moment, she realized something: this wasn't just about a seat. It was about standing up for herself, for every person who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. This was a moment she would not let pass quietly. The question now was, what would happen next? Amara stood her ground at the counter, her arms crossed in a mix of defiance and determination. The tension in the air was palpable as people around her started to murmur, sensing the conflict unfolding before them. A few passengers glanced up from their phones or magazines, casting curious glances at the scene, but Amara barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on Jason Hart, the supervisor who seemed all too eager to brush her off. "Ma'am, I don't know what you want me to do," Jason repeated, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "There's no first-class seat available. We're fully booked, and that's that." Amara's pulse quickened, but she refused to let the emotions bubbling inside her take control. She knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a small mix-up. She'd worked too hard for this seat, too long to be made to feel insignificant. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. She had spent years climbing through a system that often made it difficult for someone like her to get ahead, and now, in this moment, it felt as if all that effort, all that work, was being erased by a single mistake. A mistake that felt anything but accidental. "I'm not leaving," Amara said again, more firmly now. "I'm not going to just sit in economy because you can't get your system right. I paid for first class, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Her words seemed to strike a chord, but Jason only gave her an exasperated look before turning his attention to a few other staff members standing nearby. He muttered something under his breath, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation, but Amara wasn't going to let him get away with dismissing her. This was her moment. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that if she gave in now, it would be the first of many compromises, the first of many moments when she allowed herself to be treated less than she deserved. A few more minutes passed, but the situation didn't seem to be getting resolved. Amara's patience was wearing thin. She felt her chest tighten as the unease from earlier shifted into something deeper, a slow-burning rage that threatened to spill over. She had always worked hard to keep her emotions in check, especially in public spaces. But this? This was different. This wasn't just about a misplaced seat. This was about respect, and more than that, it was about fighting for herself when it seemed no one else would. Finally, Jason returned, flanked by a few other airline representatives. One of them, a woman who appeared to be in charge, stepped forward. Her nameplate read Linda Stevens, and she had a stern look on her face that was anything but comforting. "I understand there's been a mix-up," Linda said, her tone colder than Amara had anticipated. "But I need you to understand that we're doing everything we can. The first-class cabin is full, and there's nothing we can do about it." Amara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had heard this song and dance before. The system, the bureaucracy, the cold indifference. But something inside her clicked. She realized that it wasn't enough to simply protest in silence or to beg for her seat. She needed to make this known, to put her foot down. "I've been polite, but this is getting out of hand," Amara said, her voice unwavering. "You're telling me that I paid for something I can't have. And you're asking me to just accept it because it's policy? I'm done being polite. I'm done being invisible." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Linda Stevens seemed to hesitate. Amara could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It wasn't just the words, it was the resolve in Amara's voice that made Linda pause. This wasn't a typical customer complaint. This wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. "Look," Linda said, trying to regain her composure, "I don't know what you expect from us. We can't just move people around to make room for you." "I'm not asking you to move anyone," Amara retorted. "I'm asking you to honor my purchase. If you can't do that, then we have a bigger problem." The words felt like a victory, even though nothing had been resolved yet. Amara's heart raced as she continued to stand tall, refusing to back down. Her mind raced with thoughts of all the things she had endured just to get to this point in her life, all the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, all the moments when she had to fight harder just to be seen. But now, this was different. This time, she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Just then, the gate area fell into an eerie silence. One by one, passengers began to stop what they were doing and watch the scene unfolding before them. Amara could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. The eyes of strangers were nothing compared to the pressure of years of silently enduring the small, everyday slights that built up in her life. This was her moment to be heard. A few murmurs broke the silence as some passengers began to voice their opinions. "She's right," one man called out, his voice gruff. "They can't just take her money and offer her a downgrade. That's not right." Another voice chimed in from behind Amara. "I've seen this happen before. They do it all the time to people of color. It's messed up." The words sent a chill down Amara's spine. She hadn't wanted to think about it in those terms, but now, hearing it out loud, it hit her like a cold splash of water. She wasn't imagining things. There was a deeper, more insidious layer to this situation. It wasn't just about a seating error. It was about the way people like her were often treated, undervalued, overlooked, expected to accept less. The realization hit hard, and her stomach turned. At that moment, something shifted inside her. The anger that had been simmering in her chest, the frustration, the confusion, all suddenly solidified into something much more powerful, a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for a seat anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible. She was fighting for her own dignity. The tension in the gate area continued to build as the other passengers began to voice their support for Amara. A few passengers moved toward the counter, backing her up, demanding that the airline do something to fix the issue. The once quiet area was now buzzing with the energy of a small rebellion, and Amara felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She was no longer just a woman asking for a seat, she was leading a small, yet powerful stand against an unjust system. Meanwhile, Jason Hart and Linda Stevens seemed to grow more and more uncomfortable as the crowd around them grew. The staff, unsure of how to proceed with such an unpredictable situation, began. The words felt like a victory, even though nothing had been resolved yet. Amara's heart raced as she continued to stand tall, refusing to back down. Her mind raced with thoughts of all the things she had endured just to get to this point in her life. All the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, all the moments when she had to fight harder just to be seen. But now, this was different. This time, she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Just then, the gate area fell into an eerie silence. One by one, passengers began to stop what they were doing and watch the scene unfolding before them. Amara could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't care. The eyes of strangers were nothing compared to the pressure of years of silently enduring the small, everyday slights that built up in her life. This was her moment to be heard. A few murmurs broke the silence as some passengers began to voice their opinions. "She's right," one man called out, his voice gruff. "They can't just take her money and offer her a downgrade. That's not right." Another voice chimed in from behind Amara. "I've seen this happen before. They do it all the time to people of color. It's messed up." The words sent a chill down Amara's spine. She hadn't wanted to think about it in those terms, but now, hearing it out loud, it hit her like a cold splash of water. She wasn't imagining things. There was a deeper, more insidious layer to this situation. It wasn't just about a seating error. It was about the way people like her were often treated, undervalued, overlooked, expected to accept less. The realization hit hard, and her stomach turned. At that moment, something shifted inside her. The anger that had been simmering in her chest, the frustration, the confusion, all suddenly solidified into something much more powerful, a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for a seat anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible. She was fighting for her own dignity. The tension in the gate area continued to build as the other passengers began to voice their support for Amara. A few passengers moved toward the counter, backing her up, demanding that the airline do something to fix the issue. The once quiet area was now buzzing with the energy of a small rebellion, and Amara felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She was no longer just a woman asking for a seat, she was leading a small, yet powerful stand against an unjust system. Meanwhile, Jason Hart and Linda Stevens seemed to grow more and more uncomfortable as the crowd around them grew. The staff, unsure of how to proceed with such an unpredictable situation, began to huddle, whispering among themselves. The pressure was building, and Amara could feel it in the air. Something was going to give. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Amara heard a voice, calm and composed, cutting through the noise. A woman approached from the side, a figure who. Amara heard a voice, calm and composed, cutting through the noise. A woman approached from the side, a figure who radiated confidence and purpose. She wasn't wearing a uniform, but there was an aura about her that made her stand out. This woman, tall and with short, natural hair, walked toward Amara with a sense of authority. "I couldn't help but overhear," the woman said as she stood beside Amara. "What's going on here?" Amara turned to face her, surprised by the woman's sudden appearance but grateful for her presence. "I'm being told that my first-class seat is no longer available," Amara explained, her voice now steady, though still filled with frustration. "They're offering me economy, but I'm not accepting that. I paid for first class, and I intend to get what I paid for." The woman nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I see. And how long have you been trying to resolve this?" "For far too long," Amara replied, her voice now laced with exhaustion. "And now I'm being dismissed because I'm refusing to settle for less than what I deserve." The woman's smile widened, and she extended her hand to Amara. "I'm Dr. Patricia Moore. I think it's time we take this to the next level." With that simple introduction, Amara felt the weight of the situation shift. She wasn't alone anymore. And perhaps, just perhaps, the wheels of change were starting to turn. Amara's gaze met Dr. Patricia Moore's, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she felt a flicker of hope. The woman's presence was commanding, but there was something else about her, a quiet assurance that sent a ripple of confidence through Amara's chest. Dr. Moore was not only calm but resolute. The atmosphere around them shifted as the woman's steady demeanor began to draw the attention of those nearby, their whispers growing quieter as they watched the exchange unfold. Dr. Moore didn't seem fazed by the staff's discomfort. With a firm but polite tone, she addressed Linda Stevens, who was still trying to regain control of the situation, though it was clear she wasn't quite sure how to proceed. "Ma'am, if I could have a word with you," Dr. Moore said, stepping forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This seems to be a case of both poor customer service and perhaps more, if we look closely at the facts. I suggest we resolve this issue quickly." Linda's face flickered with an emotion that might have been fear, or perhaps frustration, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced over at Jason Hart and then at the crowd around them. Amara noticed the way the staff seemed to shrink back, as if unsure how to proceed now that there was an unexpected sense of solidarity in the air. Dr. Moore had brought with her a kind of quiet strength that made it impossible for anyone to ignore the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is something you should be involved in," Linda said, her voice slightly defensive, but Dr. Moore wasn't fazed. She gave her a smile that was at once both understanding and firm, like a teacher correcting a child's error. "I think you misunderstand," Dr. Moore said, her tone polite yet insistent. "It's not just about the seat. It's about the way your staff has handled this customer's concerns. It's about accountability and how you treat paying passengers. This is a bigger issue than a missed seat assignment. And I think you know that." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Amara's stomach twisted. Dr. Moore wasn't just pointing out the immediate problem, she was highlighting the deeper issue, the systemic nature of what had happened. It wasn't just about the fact that Amara had been bumped from first class. It was about how, when something went wrong, it was so easy for Amara to be dismissed, as though her concerns weren't worth taking seriously. And it wasn't just the airline, it was a constant reality in her life. She had seen it before. The way she, as a black woman, was often overlooked, discounted, or treated as a second-class citizen. In that moment, Dr. Moore had given voice to something Amara had felt for years but had never truly acknowledged. Linda Stevens swallowed visibly, her face flushing as she realized the larger implications of what Dr. Moore was suggesting. She opened her mouth to say something but closed it again, seemingly unsure of how to handle the situation now that it had grown beyond the immediate problem of seating. There was a silence that followed, and in that silence, Amara could feel her own emotions shifting. The anger that had been bubbling inside her began to cool, replaced by a sense of clarity. She was no longer in this alone. Dr. Moore's confidence was contagious. Amara found herself standing taller, her chest filling with a quiet resolve. She wasn't just demanding a seat anymore, she was demanding to be treated with respect. And not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. Like their concerns weren't important. She could feel the power of her own voice in the space. It wasn't just about what had happened today, but about every other time, in countless small moments, when she had been made to feel invisible or unimportant. I understand that mistakes happen, Dr. Moore continued, turning back to the airline representatives, her voice steady but with an undeniable edge. But there's a difference between a mistake and a failure to address it properly. Your customer here, Ms. Johnson, is asking for what she paid for. And as a paying customer, she deserves the respect of having her issue addressed swiftly and properly. What's happening here, with the dismissive behavior and lack of proper resolution, is unacceptable. The word struck a nerve, and for the first time, Amara could see the cracks in the defensive posture of the airline staff. Jason Hart, who had been standing off to the side, shifted uneasily. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but Dr. Moore cut him off before he could say anything. I'm sure you're aware of the public relations nightmare this could turn into, Dr. Moore added, her voice smooth but with a sharp undertone. You've got a situation that could escalate quickly. And believe me, the last thing your company needs is more negative attention over a situation that could have been resolved quietly with a little professionalism. Amara could see that Linda Stevens was now visibly sweating, her posture rigid, as if she were bracing for a storm. The airline staff was realizing that the moment had shifted, and they were no longer in control. Linda's eyes darted around the gate area, where passengers were beginning to take out their phones, the first signs of social media activity appearing as some quietly began recording the situation. The pressure in the air increased tenfold, and Amara could see that the staff was now considering the consequences of letting this go on any longer. Finally, after a long pause that felt like an eternity, Linda spoke. Her voice had lost some of its earlier arrogance, now laced with a more conciliatory tone. Ms. Johnson, Dr. Moore. I understand that you're both upset. Let's see if we can work this out. I'll check with the flight manager and see if there's anything we can do to resolve this situation, Linda said, her words rushed and tinged with the faintest trace of frustration. Amara nodded, though she wasn't about to let her guard down. I appreciate that, she said, her tone still firm. But understand that this isn't just about getting my seat. This is about accountability. It's about how your company treats people, especially when things go wrong. Linda gave a quick nod, looking slightly flustered, and turned toward the back of the gate area, presumably to find the flight manager. Meanwhile, Amara could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. It was a mix of curiosity, solidarity, and, what she realized later, a quiet admiration. Some of them had stepped away from the counters to watch the unfolding drama, and Amara could hear a few hushed conversations about what was happening. She felt the weight of it, the way her stand had turned into something more than just a simple dispute. It was becoming a statement. Thank you, Amara said to Dr. Moore, her voice lower now, though still filled with gratitude. I don't know what I would have done without you. Dr. Moore turned to her, offering a gentle smile that didn't betray any hint of smugness or satisfaction. "You did the hard part, Ms. Johnson," she replied. "You stood up for yourself. That's the hardest thing. The rest is just a matter of making them listen." The conversation was interrupted by the sudden approach of Linda Stevens, who was now accompanied by a flight manager. The man was in his late 40s, wearing a dark suit and looking as though he had just been dragged out of a meeting. He immediately assessed the situation, his eyes darting between Amara and the staff. The tension was palpable as he finally spoke. "Ms. Johnson, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I've spoken with the crew, and we've found a solution. We've upgraded your seat back to first class. There was some confusion with the system, but we'll make sure this doesn't happen again," the flight manager said, his voice slightly flat but with an air of authority that seemed to diffuse the tension somewhat. Amara's heart rate slowed, but she wasn't done yet. "Thank you for resolving the issue," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I want you to understand something, this goes beyond just a seat. I'm grateful for the resolution, but I won't forget how I was treated. I won't forget how easily I was dismissed, how quickly I was made to feel like I wasn't important. This needs to change." The flight manager nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "I understand, Ms. Johnson. And again, we sincerely apologize. We'll be looking into this further." Amara didn't feel fully satisfied, but for the first time since she had approached the counter, she felt like her voice had truly been heard. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something deeper, a quiet victory in the face of an unfair system, a system that was too quick to overlook people like her. As she walked down the jetway toward her seat in first class, Amara felt a sense of relief. It wasn't just the comfort of the seat she was looking forward to, but the knowledge that she had stood up for herself, and in doing so, had helped shift the conversation. The storm had passed for now, but Amara knew that this wouldn't be the last time she would need to fight for herself. The experience had taught her something important. Sometimes, the fight wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure that you were seen, and that the world couldn't ignore you anymore. The flight to her destination was a quiet one, but Amara couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction, mixed with a quiet disquiet. She had gotten her seat back, but that wasn't the end of the story. She sat in the first-class cabin, the plush seat beneath her a physical reminder of the victory she'd just won. Yet, as the plane lifted off and soared above the clouds, her thoughts wandered back to the chaotic moments at the gate. It wasn't just the inconvenience or the indignity she had faced, it was the realization that, once again, she had been forced into a position where her humanity had to be defended. She leaned back in the seat, closing her eyes briefly, letting the soft hum of the plane's engines drown out the noise in her head. The battle for the seat had been one thing, but the underlying battle, the one she had fought her entire life, was something much deeper. She had worked so hard, so relentlessly, to get where she was. She had climbed through the corporate ranks, faced obstacles, and always had to prove herself twice as hard to be seen as capable. But somehow, it always felt as though she had to prove that she belonged. And now, this situation, which seemed like a simple mistake on the airline's part, had uncovered something deeper, something far more troubling. Amara couldn't help but think back to the words Dr. Moore had spoken. It's not just about the seat. It's about the way your staff has handled this customer's concerns. It's about accountability and how you treat paying passengers. The truth of those words hit her hard. The seat issue, while frustrating, had been the catalyst for something much larger. It wasn't about a first-class upgrade. It was about respect, acknowledgement, and the way systems were often built to overlook people like her. Her thoughts drifted back to the faces in the gate area, the passengers who had quietly stood behind her, those who had spoken up in support. She had always known that discrimination, whether overt or subtle, existed. But seeing it play out so openly, in a place that should have been neutral, left her with a new perspective. For the first time in a long while, she felt like the collective power of the crowd, the way they had rallied behind her, had turned the tide. It was as if they had seen the injustice, and in their willingness to speak up, they too had become part of the solution. The plane's intercom crackled, snapping her out of her thoughts as the flight attendants began their service. Amara politely accepted a drink, nodding her thanks as she glanced around at the other passengers. No one seemed to notice her, they were all engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to the quiet internal battle she had just fought. She wondered what would happen when she got off the plane. Would the incident be forgotten by the time she reached her destination? Or would it linger in her mind, as it always did, like a thorn she couldn't remove? As the flight continued, Amara found herself replaying the events at the gate in her mind. Dr. Moore had been the catalyst, the unexpected ally who had turned the situation around. But what if she hadn't been there? What if Amara had been left to handle the confrontation alone? Would she have backed down, or would she have dug in her heels? It was a sobering thought, and one that made her realize just how often people like her, people who weren't easily seen or heard, had to rely on the kindness or courage of others in moments of crisis. The incident had been resolved, but the larger issue remained. Amara knew that this wasn't just about an airline or a singular injustice. This was a microcosm of something much larger, the way black women were often treated in spaces that should have been neutral, spaces that should have been inclusive. It wasn't just the systemic inequities she had faced in her career, it was in the everyday, seemingly insignificant moments that chipped away at her sense of belonging. The way her opinions had been disregarded in meetings, the way she had been excluded from opportunities for advancement, the way she was constantly being asked to prove her worth in ways that others never had to. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. A text from her best friend, Nadia, popped up on the screen. "Hey, how's the flight? Everything okay?" Amara smiled as she read the message. Nadia had been her confidant for years, the person she could always rely on to offer a sense of calm when everything around her felt chaotic. Nadia had listened to Amara vent countless times about the microaggressions she faced in her corporate job, the subtle ways in which her worth was questioned. Amara quickly typed back, "I'm good, but something happened at the airport today that I need to tell you about. It's crazy." She set the phone down and looked out the window, watching the clouds roll by, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. The next few hours passed in a blur. The hum of the plane, the soft chatter of fellow passengers, and the sound of the flight attendants going through their routine all blended together as Amara remained lost in her thoughts. By the time the plane touched down, Amara had made a decision. The incident at the airport, though resolved in her favor, had sparked something inside her. She could no longer just accept the way things were. It wasn't enough to get by, to keep her head down and do her job. She had been doing that her whole life. She had been playing by the rules, abiding by the norms, but what had it gotten her? A first-class seat, yes, but at what cost? She stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, but she knew she couldn't go back to business as usual. The moment at the airport had shown her the power of standing up, of refusing to be silenced. But it had also opened her eyes to how much more work needed to be done, not just in the corporate world, but in society as a whole. As Amara made her way through the airport, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. She clicked on the headline. Public outcry after woman denied first-class seat on major airline. Is this a case of racial discrimination? Her heart skipped a beat. The story had gone public. The video from the airport, filmed by an onlooker, had already gone viral. The words racial discrimination were right there in the headline, and suddenly, she understood the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern that many people had been too afraid to talk about. But now, it was out in the open. Amara stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had become the face of something much bigger than herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the scrutiny that would come with it, but she knew she couldn't walk away now. The floodgates had opened, and she had to decide whether she would stay silent or step forward into the light. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision, and then she sent a quick text to Nadia, "It's bigger than I thought. This could change everything." As she moved through the terminal, the phone buzzing with new messages, Amara felt an unfamiliar sense of resolve. Whatever happened next, she would not go quietly. It was time to make her voice heard, for herself and for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, and silenced. The days following the viral spread of the incident felt like a whirlwind. Amara's phone was flooded with messages, notifications, and news alerts. Media outlets across the country were picking up the story, with headlines ranging from outrage to deep concern about the systemic issues of race and class. What had started as a personal confrontation over a first-class seat had morphed into a nationwide conversation about racial injustice, privilege, and the ways in which individuals are treated based on their identity. Amara wasn't sure how to process everything that was happening. At first, she was overwhelmed by the attention. Journalists reached out for interviews, some wanting to paint her as a victim, others framing her as a symbol of resistance. Every conversation felt like a delicate balance of expressing her frustration while maintaining the dignity she'd fought so hard to preserve. In the midst of all this, Nadia had been her rock, offering her a much-needed sense of clarity and perspective when the pressure began to mount. "Remember why you're doing this," Nadia had said during one of their late-night phone calls. "This isn't just about you anymore. You've tapped into something so much bigger, something people have been afraid to talk about for too long. You have a platform now. What you do with it matters." Nadia's words echoed in Amara's mind as she sat in her hotel room, preparing for the most significant decision of her life. The media attention wasn't dying down. If anything, it was intensifying. The story had moved from local news outlets to major national ones. The hashtag #FirstClassForAll was trending, with people sharing their own experiences of racial discrimination, both on airplanes and in everyday life. There were stories from all over the country, from people who had been denied basic respect, whether it was at work, in public spaces, or, like Amara, in the middle of a travel experience. Amara knew that this was bigger than her. It wasn't about the seat or the inconvenience of being bumped from first class. This was about the way society had conditioned itself to ignore the concerns of marginalized groups, especially black women. It was about the deeply ingrained biases that had created a world where people like her were often treated as second-class citizens, regardless of their achievements or status. But even as she began to embrace the weight of her newfound role as a voice for change, Amara struggled with the pressure. It was one thing to speak out in the privacy of her own thoughts or in a small circle of trusted friends. It was another to take on the responsibility of becoming a symbol. What would this mean for her career? For her personal life? She couldn't deny the feeling of anxiety that gripped her every time she opened her inbox or scrolled through social media, seeing the mixed reactions, the praise from some, the criticism from others, and the downright venomous comments from a few. The airline, in an effort to calm the storm, had issued a public apology, stating that they had launched an internal investigation into the incident. They offered Amara a formal apology, as well as an invitation to meet with executives to discuss ways to improve customer service and ensure that incidents of discrimination like this were addressed more effectively. It was clear that they were trying to salvage their reputation, but Amara wasn't sure if their apology was sincere or just a corporate maneuver to placate the public. As Amara sat in her room, contemplating the next steps, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Dr. Moore, the woman who had helped her in the airport that day. She had sent a simple text, "Are you ready to make a change?" The message made Amara's heart race. Dr. Moore had been more than just an ally, she had become a mentor of sorts, someone who had seen the bigger picture and who had recognized the potential for real change. The day at the airport had been the spark, but it was clear to Amara now that this was about something much more profound. She had already made a difference by standing up for herself, but the real challenge would be using her platform to create lasting change. She quickly typed back, "I think I'm ready. But I don't know where to start." Dr. Moore's reply was immediate: "Start with your story. Start with your truth. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every woman who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel less than. And when you're ready, we'll talk strategy. But for now, focus on sharing your experience. The world is listening." Amara set the phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. What did it mean to truly speak her truth? She had always been careful with her words, always measured, always aware of how her voice might be perceived. But now, in this moment, the stakes felt higher than they ever had before. If she spoke, there would be no going back. She would be stepping into the public spotlight in a way she had never anticipated. That evening, she decided to take the first step. She composed a post on social media, pouring out her heart. She wrote about the events at the airport, about the way she had been treated, and about the emotional toll it had taken on her. But she didn't stop there. She wrote about the systemic issues that had led to that moment. She spoke about the ways in which Black women, despite their success and achievements, were still often treated as inferior, still had to fight for the same respect that others took for granted. "I didn't get on that plane because of the seat. I got on that plane because I belong here. And so do you," she wrote, closing her post with a call to action. "It's time to speak up. It's time to demand respect. It's time for change." She hit post and sat back, her hands trembling slightly. She knew this would be the moment that defined her. But she also knew that this was a moment she could no longer ignore. The words she had shared were not just her own, they were the words of so many others who had silently borne the weight of discrimination, of feeling overlooked, of being made to feel that they didn't belong. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, her post had thousands of likes, shares, and comments. People from all over the world, from various walks of life, from all races and backgrounds, began to share their own stories. Some shared experiences of discrimination they had faced at airports, in the workplace, or in public spaces. Others expressed their support for Amara, telling her that her courage had inspired them to speak up, too. But there were also the inevitable detractors. There were the people who called her an attention seeker, who accused her of playing the race card, who suggested that she should have just let it go. They were the voices that had always been there, trying to silence the cries for justice, trying to put the blame back on the victim. Amara read through the comments with a sense of resolve. She wasn't naive enough to think that everyone would agree with her, or that the fight would be easy. But she knew, in that moment, that her voice had already made a difference. She had started a conversation, and conversations were the first step toward change. The next few weeks were a blur of media interviews, public appearances, and meetings with the airline. Amara used every opportunity to speak out, to raise awareness, and to push for systemic change. She met with airline executives, discussing policies that needed to be implemented to prevent discrimination, and she pushed for the creation of a support system for marginalized passengers. But it wasn't just about the airline. It was about creating a larger platform for change, one that could reach beyond just the airline industry. She began working with civil rights organizations, using her newfound platform to advocate for policies that would address racial discrimination in all sectors of society. The movement she had unintentionally ignited was gaining momentum, and she realized that this was her chance to be a part of something bigger than herself. Months later, Amara found herself at the forefront of a movement that was challenging the status quo. The first-class incident had been the spark, but the fire that it had ignited was far from extinguished. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to continue the fight, to stand up for herself, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Amara had found her voice, and in doing so, had become part of a larger conversation about equality, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right. As she looked back at everything she had accomplished, she couldn't help but smile. The journey wasn't over, but it had only just begun. Months had passed since the incident at the airport, and Amara found herself navigating a new reality, one that she had never fully anticipated. What had begun as a personal battle over a first-class seat had spiraled into something much bigger. Her name had become synonymous with a larger movement for justice, respect, and racial equality. Yet, amid the media coverage, the public appearances, and the countless interviews, Amara had to come to terms with something deeper. The weight of being at the forefront of such a monumental shift was both empowering and overwhelming. Amara had spent much of her adult life working tirelessly to carve out a space for herself in environments that were often hostile to people who looked like her. She had earned her place in the corporate world through sheer determination, overcoming barriers that were as much a part of her daily reality as her ambition. She had learned to navigate the subtle, and at times not so subtle, acts of discrimination. But this was different. This was no longer just about her personal journey. This was about every person who had ever felt less than, who had been passed over, who had been denied access or respect simply because of their race or gender. The first time she spoke at a press conference about the incident, she had been a bundle of nerves, unsure of how to articulate the complexities of the situation. But now, she was more composed. She had found her voice, not just for herself but for all the people who had been quietly enduring the same indignities for far too long. With each interview, she felt more solid in her message. But she also knew that her message had to go beyond just raising awareness. It had to spark real change. The media had painted her as the face of a movement, but Amara knew that movements were never just about individuals. They were about collective voices coming together to challenge the status quo. She felt the weight of that responsibility every time she spoke. She was now a symbol, whether she liked it or not, for the fight against racial discrimination. And yet, there were moments when she questioned whether she was doing enough. It wasn't just the public pressure that weighed on her. It was the internal struggle, the fear that she might be sacrificing too much for this cause. She had been thrust into a spotlight that was both exhilarating and draining. With every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps backward. There were nights when she stayed awake, unable to sleep, thinking about the implications of her newfound position. Was she ready to be a leader in this fight? Did she have the stamina to push through what was sure to be an arduous battle? But then she would remember the faces of the people who had reached out to her, the stories they shared of their own experiences with discrimination. She remembered the support of the passengers at the airport who had stood behind her when the airline had tried to push her out of first class. Those moments reminded her of the importance of what she was doing. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the people whose voices had been silenced for too long. It was in these moments of doubt that Amara found her clarity. She had learned, through every struggle and setback, that the road to real change was never smooth. It was messy, complex, and full of resistance. But she also knew that change was possible, even if it came one step at a time. One of the most significant turning points came when Amara was invited to speak at a national civil rights conference. It was a gathering of activists, policymakers, and thought leaders, all of whom had been working tirelessly for decades to address the systemic issues of racism and inequality in America. Amara had hesitated at first, unsure if she was truly ready to stand alongside these giants in the field. But Dr. Moore, who had become a trusted mentor, urged her to take the opportunity. "You have a voice, Amara," Dr. Moore said during one of their long conversations. "People are listening to you. What you have to say matters. This is your chance to be part of something transformative." The day of the conference arrived, and Amara stood backstage, waiting for her turn to speak. The weight of the moment hit her harder than she had expected. She was about to speak to an audience that included some of the most respected figures in the fight for civil rights. Her hands trembled, and her heart raced. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw not just the faces of those who had been fighting this battle for decades, but the faces of countless others who had been waiting for someone to stand up and say, "This is wrong." When Amara stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath and began to speak, not just from her own experience but from the heart of every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, and marginalized. She spoke about the incident at the airport, but she also spoke about the everyday struggles that Black women faced in every sector of society. She spoke about the long history of racial inequality and how the fight for justice was far from over. She challenged the audience to stop seeing these issues as isolated incidents and start recognizing them as part of a larger system of oppression. Amara's words resonated with the crowd. As she spoke, she saw people nodding, listening intently, some even wiping away tears. It wasn't just the power of her message that was making an impact, it was the authenticity with which she shared her truth. She wasn't speaking from a place of anger or bitterness. She was speaking from a place of hope, hope that things could change if enough people were willing to stand together and demand that they do so. The standing ovation she received after her speech was overwhelming, but it wasn't the applause that stuck with her. It was the realization that her voice had not only been heard, it had been felt. She had made a connection with the audience, and that connection had the potential to spark real, lasting change. In the days that followed, Amara's message continued to gain traction. News outlets picked up on her speech, and social media was abuzz with support and debate. Many people began to share their own stories of discrimination, and it became clear that the conversation was no longer just about one incident, it was about a systemic issue that had been ignored for far too long. But despite the momentum, Amara knew that there was still so much work to be done. The airline had taken some steps to address the incident, but it was just one company in a vast system of institutions that needed reform. She began working more closely with civil rights organizations, helping to draft policies aimed at preventing discrimination in the workplace, in public spaces, and in the private sector. She worked alongside lawmakers to propose new legislation that would hold companies accountable for discriminatory practices. But even as Amara took on these new responsibilities, she continued to feel the weight of the cause. She knew that there would be setbacks, moments of resistance, and challenges along the way. She also knew that the fight for racial equality was not a battle that could be won overnight. It was a long, arduous process, and it would require the collective effort of countless people who were willing to speak out and demand change. Amara also learned to take care of herself amidst all the chaos. She had to find balance in a life that had been forever altered by the incident at the airport. She made time to reconnect with the people who mattered most to her, her family, her friends, and her mentors. She found solace in moments of quiet reflection, whether it was sitting on her porch with a cup of tea or taking long walks in the park to clear her mind. In the midst of everything, Amara never lost sight of the goal. To create a world where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, was treated with dignity and respect. The journey was far from over, but Amara had become a beacon of hope for those who had long been waiting for change. She had become the voice that spoke for the voiceless, the person who refused to accept the status quo. And as she continued to push forward, Amara knew that the fight for equality was not just her fight, it was everyone's fight. Years later, as she looked back on the events that had changed her life, Amara knew that the struggle was far from over. But she had faith that the next generation would carry the torch forward and continue the work she had started. And in that belief, she found the strength to keep going, knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory in itself.